students of class 6, welcome back to our social science class. So today we are going to have a recall of our history lesson 1, Vedic culture in North India and megalithic culture in South India. So for the past 3 sessions we have learnt about the same lesson 1 of history. I hope you remember what we have learned in the past 3 sessions. So today, as an overall of the lesson Vedic culture in North India and megalithic culture in South India, I am going to recall the important points. So quickly, let's get into the video. First, the important point that we saw is about the Vedic Age. We saw that the Vedic Age came in after the decline of the Indus civilization, and the Vedic Age is the arrival of Aryans. So who are Aryans? Aryans are people who were semi-nomadic and they were mostly having cattle. So they did not stay in one place. They kept moving from place to place for their cattle and pasture. So there were 2 phases of Vedic Age. The first Vedic Age was the early Vedic period, and the second was the later Vedic period. And the first Vedic period was 1500 to 1000 BC. And the later Vedic age was the 1000 to 600 BC. So the Vedic age, that is the arrival of the Aryans, were divided into early and later. Then we are now able to look at the extent of Vedic culture. So as we saw here in the map, we see the early Vedic period as well as the later Vedic period. As we saw, the Aryans kept moving from one place to another. So during the early period, they stayed in the place which is marked in green, and in the later Vedic period, they stayed in the places like Ayodhya, near Ganga and Yamuna. So this was the places where they lived. And what was the home of Aryans? So as they were semi-nomadic, that is, they never lived in one place, they did not have a specific homeland. But in the Rig Vedic times, the Aryan homeland was Punjab. So earlier it used to be Punjab. And Aryans in India moved eastward and settled in Indo-Gangetic plain. So earlier they were in Punjab, but later when they came to India, they started moving eastward and settled in the Indo-Gangetic plain. So these were about the Aryans who lived in the Vedic Age. So moving on to the literature that they had. What were the literature that they had? Yes, they had Shruti and Smriti. So under Shruti they had 4 Vedas and Aranyakas, Brahmanas and Upanishads. And under Smriti they had Itihas, Puranas, Ramayana, Mahabharata, Shiva Purana, Vishnu Purana and Sustras. And under Sustras they had 3, which were Dharma Sustra, Manu Smriti and Narada Smriti. So these were the texts that they had during their age. Moving on to their culture. So what was their culture? Under culture they had polity and society, that is, they had a society which had a Gramani and a head. So they also had tribal people who were a group of tribals. So the society was none other than the people in the village, and they had a head who was called the Gramani. And when we move on to the king, these people were earlier ruled by a king, and this king was always according to their heritage, that is, they came from their father and their grandfathers. So this king first came in as hereditary, but later they started a fear in the minds of the people by collecting bali, that is tax. Then when we look at the social organization, we have the varna system, that is, before first we had the brahmanas, kshatriyas and vyasas, but later when the Aryans wanted the non-Aryan as their skilled workers, they had 4 classification, and that was called as the varna system. That is, the priests were known as the brahmanas, then the warriors were known as the kshatriyas, the land owners were called as the vyasyas, and the skilled workers were called as the sudras. So this was all about the social organization. So the people were classified into 4 types. They were all not together, or they were not the same. And moving on, we had the status of women. Earlier, women had freedom, they had no restrictions, but they had restriction for one thing, that was the land. They did not own a land. But later, women did not have much freedom. They had a lot of rules. They were not given education, and they were made to sit at homes. So that was the status of women in the Vedic period. Moving on to the economic life was, they were people who did agriculture and they had cattle. So they reared cattle and they lived their life. And later we saw that they also did pots. So pottery making was also a part of their occupation. Then we saw about their religion, that is, they worship the nature as God for fertility, for rain, for crops, etc. So that was all about their Vedic culture. Then we looked at their education system, that is the Gurukula system, which was the ancient method where they had guru and the students. So what happened here was, the students learned from the gurus and they lived with them, and they saw each and every way of their living and learned from it. So the subjects were Vedas, Itihas, Puranas, and they had grammar, logic, ethics, astrology, maths and military science. So these were the subjects they had, and the main training there was the discipline. Then according to them, they had 4 stages in life, that was the student life, brahmacharya, married life, grihastha, going to forest to meditate, that was vanaprastha, and finally leading a life of aesthetic, so to attain swarga, that is heaven, that was called as the sannyasa. So these were the 4 stages of their life. Then we saw about the contemporary culture in South India and Tamil Nadu, and this was also classified into 2 types, early and later. The early period was called as the Chalcolithic period, and the later period was called as the Megalithic period, because in the early period they used stones and coppers, and in the later period These people were mostly having agriculture and cattle. So this was about the two divisions. Moving on, we saw about the archaeological sites in Tamil Nadu. So the places which the archaeologists found as a evidence regarding the megathic or the Iron Age were these. That is, first was Adichanallur, Thoothukudi district. Then we saw about the Keeladi, which was in Sivagangai district, Porundal, Dindikal district, Payampalli, Vellore district, and Kodumanal, which is in the Erode district. So these were the places which had evidences regarding these people who belonged to the Vedic ages. So what all did they find in these places? They found bricks which they used. They saw old houses, drainage systems. Mainly they found jewelry items like beads, then pearl, and then they found weaving. They found pots. Most often they found the pots, broken pots, or the main monuments that they had, or the burial places that they had. So these were some of the evidences that they got. And they also found many pots with scripts of the early religions. So this little pots and the monuments, the buildings and other small things proves that the megathic or the Iron Age existed on earth, and they tell about the Aryans. So these were all about the lesson 1 of history. So I hope you had a recall of everything. So that's all for today's class, students. Thank you. Take care until we meet in the next class.